When we think of slavery in ancient Rome, many assume that masters had total, unchecked power over their slaves, that they could command them to do anything, punish them however they wished, torture them, or even kill them, without facing any consequences. And truthfully, that assumption isn't far from the truth. Under Roman law, slaves were considered property, not people, but speaking tools. Still, it would be an oversimplification to claim that every master had the right to do absolutely anything to any slave at any time with zero repercussions. So let's take a closer look at what truly limited a master's power, what those restrictions were, how they worked, and when they actually applied. Slavery in Rome spanned more than 12 centuries, and the conditions and rights of slaves varied greatly over time. According to the Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Romulus, Rome's first king and mythical founder, allowed citizens to sell their own children into slavery. This strongly suggests that slavery existed in Rome from the very beginning. But over the following 200 years, both the legal status of slaves and the laws that governed them evolved dramatically. In its earliest days, Rome was a modest town with a small population, and the number of slaves was even smaller. During the monarchy and early republic, economic inequality wasn't especially stark. Even the wealthiest Romans were often landowners who worked their fields alongside a few slaves. This created a more personal, often surprisingly amicable, relationship between masters and slaves. After all, it's harder to be cruel to someone you labor beside day after day. Of course, that closeness came with its own dangers. A master who pushed too hard might find himself with a hoe embedded in the back of his skull. In the later Roman Empire, escape wasn't much of an option for slaves. Rome's influence was too vast. But in early Roman history, the landscape was different. Neighboring tribes or settlements were only a short walk away. Disappearing was easy. Finding a runaway was nearly impossible. That's one of the reasons why early Roman slave owners tended to treat their slaves with relative leniency. But this dynamic changed as Rome expanded. As conquests increased, war brought in wave after wave of prisoners. By the 5th century BC, slaves made up around 20% of the Roman population and had become absolutely essential to the functioning of the Roman economy. From that point forward, the treatment of slaves in ancient Rome steadily deteriorated. During the entire Republican era, there were no formal legal limits placed on a master's authority over their slaves. In practice, Roman masters had near total control and could treat their slaves however they pleased. The only faint hope for protection came from the censors, powerful magistrates with the authority to enter households, intervene in cases of excessive cruelty, and even punish the master. But it's important to understand that this power was a right, not a duty. Censors were not investigators, nor did they regularly monitor the treatment of slaves. Slaves themselves had no legal standing and could not appeal directly to a censor for help. Only a free citizen could report abuse, and even then, the censor could ignore the complaint entirely if they so chose. Moreover, the office of censor wasn't a permanent one. Censors were elected only once every 5 years, and each held office for a term of just 18 months. That meant there were intervals of 3.5 years where no censor held power. No officials existed who could intervene, even in theory. Over the more than 4 centuries between the creation of the censor's office and the rise of the Roman Empire, there is not a single recorded instance of a censor stepping in to protect a slave. That doesn't mean it never happened, but it does strongly suggest that such interventions were extraordinarily rare. During the imperial era, however, there are at least 2 well-documented cases where an emperor, who also held censorial powers, personally intervened to protect a slave. The first took place at a banquet hosted by the equestrian Vettius Pollio. When one of Pollio's slaves accidentally broke an expensive crystal goblet, the furious host ordered the man to be thrown into a tank of lampreys as punishment. Emperor Augustus, who was present, stepped in. He not only spared the slave's life, but granted him his freedom. As a final rebuke, Augustus ordered that all the remaining crystal goblets in the house be smashed in front of Pollio. In the second case, Emperor Hadrian exiled a Roman noblewoman named Umbra from the city for 5 years after she viciously beat a young slave girl over a trivial offense. Though these cases were rare, they underscore an important reality. While censors and emperors had the legal authority to protect slaves, they almost never used it. Unless the cruelty was public, excessive, and impossible to ignore. Around the beginning of the Common Era, a handful of new laws began offering slaves the first traces of legal protection, placing minimal limits on a master's unchecked cruelty. In 4 BC and 2 BC, the Lex Aelia Sentia and Lex Canina were enacted to regulate manumission, particularly restricting how many slaves could be freed at once, especially by testament. Later, under Emperor Claudius, another law was passed. If a master abandoned a sick slave, and that slave managed to recover on their own without help, they would automatically be granted their freedom. The master was also responsible for burying their slave. If they refused to do so, anyone else could carry out the burial and then sue the master to recover the expenses. In 61 AD, the Lex Petronia prohibited owners from sending their slaves to be torn apart by wild animals without a judge's approval. Emperors Domitian and later Hadrian banned the castration of slaves. In 161 AD, Emperor Antoninus Pius prohibited the unjustified killing of slaves. A master who was found guilty of deliberately killing their own slave was held to the same legal standard as if they had killed someone else's slave. Such an owner could be fined and was also required to pay the value of the murdered slave. In 319 AD, Emperor Constantine's law went even further, equating the killing of a slave with the murder of a free person. However, both Constantine's and Antoninus Pius's laws held the master accountable only if the killing was intentional. For example, if the slave was stabbed with a dagger, hanged, thrown from a great height, or fed to wild beasts. On the other hand, if a slave died as a result of punishments considered normal in Roman society, such as being beaten to death with whips, the law placed no blame on the master. In addition to laws that offered slaves a minimal degree of protection, classical Roman law also included 4 standard clauses that could be added to a contract for the sale of a slave. One such clause, ne manumitatur, prohibited the buyer from freeing the purchased slave. This condition could be added at the seller's request for various reasons. For instance, when selling an elderly slave, the seller might include this clause to prevent the slave from being freed, thereby ensuring the individual would continue to receive at least some minimal care and support in old age. Since masters were legally required to provide for their slaves, many elderly slaves who could no longer work were simply freed to reduce the economic burden. In contrast, a seller might include the ne manumitatur clause if they believed the slave did not deserve freedom. By contrast, the ut manumitatur clause required the buyer to free the slave after a set period of time as specified in the sale contract. The ut exportatur clause obligated the buyer to remove the slave from a specific city or region and barred them from bringing the slave back. In some cases, even if the slave was later freed, returning to that area could result in re-enslavement. Finally, the ne prostituatur clause explicitly prohibited the buyer from forcing a female slave into prostitution. Together, these laws and contractual clauses represented some of the few legal mechanisms in Rome that sought to moderate, however slightly, the harsh realities of slavery in the ancient world. These clauses remained legally binding, even if the slave was resold. For instance, if a buyer purchased a slave girl and later sold her without disclosing the ne prostituatur clause, and the new owner forced her into prostitution, the courts could intervene. In such cases, the slave would be granted her freedom and legally become a freed woman under her original seller. Interestingly, there were no equivalent clauses restricting a slave's use in other professions. Only prostitution drew this level of legal attention. In early Roman law, the penalties for violating these clauses were typically specified in the contract itself. For example, breaking the ne prostituatur clause could result in a fine, the return of the slave to her previous owner, or immediate manumission. Under Emperor Constantine, this clause was eventually standardized across the empire. If violated, the slave was automatically freed, and her legal patron would be her original seller. So, while a few laws in the Roman Empire imposed limited restrictions on a master's cruelty, the reality of slavery remained brutally harsh. Roman legal commentaries made it clear that these regulations were not motivated by compassion or concern for the slave's well-being. They were designed primarily to prevent unrest and maintain public order. Even the most effective legal protections, like ne prostituatur or ut manumitatur, were not universally applied. They only protected the slave if a previous owner had taken the initiative to include them in a formal sale contract. Most slaves had no such safeguards. For the vast majority, Roman law offered no protection at all. Even in its most progressive moments, the legal system of ancient Rome treated slaves not as people, but as property, tools to be used, discarded, or replaced at the discretion of their masters. The few rules that were enforced served mainly to prevent the destruction or misuse of these tools, rather than to preserve any sense of dignity or humanity. Once again, if you've made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate your time. If you enjoyed the content, please consider liking and subscribing. We have an entire team working hard behind the scenes, and your support helps us continue creating thoughtful, historical explorations like this. We release new content every single week. If you'd like to go even further in supporting our work, you can join us on Patreon for early access, behind-the-scenes updates, and more. Every bit of support makes a huge difference. You can also leave a super thanks down below if you'd like to give us an extra boost. It really helps, and we're incredibly grateful. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you next time. The story of slavery in ancient Rome reminds us how easily systems of power can dehumanize others when unchecked. Though we no longer live in that world, modern forms of exploitation, forced labor, human trafficking, and workplace abuse still exist. Roman law evolved only when public unrest or political need demanded it. Today, we must not wait for injustice to become visible to act. Speak up for the voiceless. Challenge systems that ignore human dignity, and support laws that protect the vulnerable. Progress depends on empathy and the courage to make justice a proactive, not reactive, priority.